Chapter 15. Battles over the Gospel. Paul and Barnabas, after so many struggles and new endeavors, now they with great joy in their hearts return to Antioch, and the community of the church there is rejoiced as well with their presence. But then they face something that is very different, a struggle within their own movement. And this is how Emmanuel describes it. He says, the battles were about the circumcision, which was pretty much like a rule of engagement. Even the most eminent leaders were divided by dogmatic affirmations. The differences had become so heated that the voices of the Holy Spirit no longer manifested. That's a parenthesis for us, because if we don't have harmony inside, we'll face hardships in the expression of our mediumship as well. But besides that point, here is Emmanuel teaching us, and we learn from the history of these people that first they were human beings. Second, as human beings, we face struggles. People have different opinions. And in this case, James and others believed that it was necessary to have established a rule of engagement, which was similar to the Judaic tradition. But Paul didn't believe so. He said in his own words that the gospel was free, he said, and the circumcision was nothing more than a conventional characteristic of the Judaic intolerance. So the whole chapter is about the battles within the movement of Christ, of the Christian movement. There are many lessons here for us as human beings, as a spiritist, as the person in the dissemination. There are many people who say, for example, I will stop going to this church or to the Spiritist center or to that religious temple because I don't agree with that leader or with that person, or I don't agree with... But what these people don't understand is that this is so natural. It is natural that we actually become, express our differences. In that regard, Paul was working hard, really hard, to bring these teachings to the Gentiles. But Emmanuel says the Gentiles were treated with scorn. They were not treated the same. And Paul couldn't agree with that behavior. He said, we are Christians. Jesus never did that. He said his people would come from east and west. So how come we are treating ourselves differently? And then Peter comes to resolve the issue in the church of Antioch. And he's doing well until the moment that two people that were sent by James from the church in Jerusalem with letters to Peter changes his behavior. And Paul is quite upset about it. And in front of everybody, he says, I cannot agree with Paul's attitude towards the Gentiles. And in a most compelling example to all of us, Peter, as Emmanuel describes, very calm and serene, he approaches the crowd and says, brothers, I have erred too much in this world. It is no secret to anyone that I have denied the Master. I have erred among the beloved brothers of Antioch, and I ask forgiveness. Isn't it also time for us to think about that it is most beautiful when we recognize our mistakes and ask for forgiveness to people in our lives? Imagine to people who have the same idea as ourselves. And Emmanuel teaches us that this attitude by Simon Peter saved the just-born church, the nascent church. He could have divided the movement right there. There would be two two sections in the movement, and he didn't. So he saved it. So he had an agreement with Paul. We're going to go to Jerusalem, and there we're going to have a meeting and discuss how we're going to decide the engagement of the Gentiles. Should they also be circumcised or not? Well, to summarize it, they went to Jerusalem. It wasn't easy. It was quite difficult. The struggles were great. But in one of the most special moments for all of us, as the manual describes, the moment of the emancipation proclamation of the Gentiles. That moment is very important for us because very likely we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for those moments in which it was finally decided that Christ's message was for everyone. And there would be no rule of engagement, but just to accept the teachings and follow them. But this all happened not only because Paul worked very hard to that and his friends, but also Peter, in Emmanuel's words, worked with indubitable prudence and common sense. Leaders need to be prudent, need to be calmer. They cannot give in to self-interest. They need to care for the general good. Otherwise, we'll never succeed as a movement. And we're talking about it in the movement of goodness in general. So here's where we stop for the first exercise of gratitude. Of all the things we're reading, one most important feeling is of gratitude. Masaru Emoto, the Japanese researcher that studied the vibrations of our feelings, prayers, thoughts onto the molecules of the water, he said that we have inside of us the most special feeling, gratitude. Imagine if they hadn't decided that we, the Gentiles, wouldn't be allowed inside the movement, or there would be rules of engagement. We wouldn't be here. So let's spend a minute closing our eyes and sending our gratitude, because now we know the message. And another major highlight in this chapter, besides so many others, is when John Mark comes back in our story, and Barnabas, his uncle, wants to bring him in, and Paul says, I don't think he will be ready for this. And for this much, Barnabas and Paul spoil their friendship, and then Paul gives us the ultimate teaching for nowadays. And this is the teaching. He says, Barnabas, almost always, friendship with God is incompatible with friendship with the world. We shall never be disappointed if in our faithfulness to God's will, we find that the closest ones in our lives will not match it. So let us now say a prayer. And in this prayer, diving within ourselves in acceptance that when we are aligned with God, not necessarily will be aligned with the world. As now we prepare for chapter 16.